Proportional Response, Book 1. Chapter 22, Part 3, Practice Makes Grumpy. Kaz looked about the room and considered everyone for a moment as the bad news about some species and their ability to survive on nutrient paste for prolonged periods sank in. This issue with what the refugees are being fed is something we are going to need to address in the Council, along with finding a creative solution to the exultant captains selling off the paste at, no doubt, exorbitant prices. In the short term, though, I am rather more concerned about the Penigra apparently running out of the stuff. They are usually very fair-minded about selling the paste, particularly in times of strife. This is an uncharacteristic move for them. That worries me. Both Ballard and Galen made dismissive gestures, but Ballard spoke first. The Penigra have also been somewhat opportunistic. No doubt, the Republic is paying high prices to be given the majority of the supply. That, or the Insular Monarchy, is facing some sort of internal crisis. Again, and isn't telling anyone or reaching out for help. Kasler shrugged. Possible, and I guess we have far greater matters to concern us. Still, they are a terribly hidebound people, and I don't like it when they start acting out of character. He gave Yoro a sidelong glance, and Enable felt her tap a finger in acknowledgement to her husband's unspoken request. The Duke then waved the concern away and continued speaking. Well, I guess we can table that question for the time being and go back to things that we can act on immediately, like the circus that tomorrow's council session is going to be, when this whole thing about piracy, nutrient paste, and the refugees all converge to make life interesting. Here is what I plan, and it is going to mean that all of you are going to have to prep several other ambassadors to streamline the discussions. Kaslo sat on his platform at the top of the council chamber and tried to get a feel for the room. He closed his eyes and let his chin fall a little so that he could concentrate on the sounds which permeated the oversized chamber. He'd used this particular trick in the Imperial Conclave on a number of occasions, sometimes to great effect. Let the words themselves fade. Wait, easier answer to that. Switch off the translator. Good. Now follow the tone of the voices, the rise and fall of the conversations. He cast his senses out, sought to understand the emotions behind the verbalizations, but soon gave up. Too foreign. I never realized just how much the translators help with interpreting tone and subtext of language. I'll have to repeat this exercise more in the future when I don't need to actually pay attention to the discussions themselves. He heard another door cycle on his level and brought himself out of his semi-meditative state. He glanced over to see the second ambassador for the Exaltants, that same worm who had tried to assume the acting prime minister position, and stood. We have enough of the ambassadors here to start the session, and that little monster will try to take the initiative if I give him half a chance, and that won't do. This will be far less irritating if he never gets the chance to plant his feet. Well, at least not until we are ready to sucker punch him. Kaslo stood and spoke without preamble, nor waiting to make sure he had everyone's attention. He hurried through the formalities and wished he could let Enable take on this part, but the plan required he be seen to be acting like the Prime Minister. He looked around the room while he called the ambassadors to order, announced date and session number, laid out, again, the bylaws they'd be operating under since they had no acting Prime Minister. A lot of ambassadors, even ones who remained closely tied to the Exaltan, looked at him with respect and more attention than they had shown Kilintar or Jalat. The Penigra, of course, sat there aloof and inscrutable as ever, but the Zoltan eyed him with deepening levels of suspicion that seemed to go beyond the verbal battle which lay ahead of them today. That guy might be almost as arrogant as the voters he answers to, but non-voters don't get to a position as high as his by being stupid. Someone is going to have to find a way to throw him off the scent, or he may start to suspect some of the larger plans. His mouth started forming the final phrase, and Kasler jerked his attention back to his tar. He continued speaking without break to make sure the Zoltan didn't get the chance, though the man did try to interject. Now, my fellow ambassadors, all of you have received the briefing about today's primary topics, a series of interrelated charges, countercharges and discoveries brought about by a human privateer vessel. Privateer? Pirate. Piracy is strictly forbidden by league. The Zoltan didn't even get his full sentence out before enough ambassadors voted to mute his interruption. I am glad we got the resolution to put that system into place. Well, usually I'm glad of it. The Duke continued. Thank you all. In times of strife such as this, it is imperative, even more than in times of peace, that we maintain decorum in this hall. Everyone will, of course, have their chance to make their case. Sadly, he took a look around the chamber and could see a number of ambassadors who he knew had nothing actually relevant to add lean forward and smile at the remark. The 3 days we allocated may not be enough. However, I would ask, even beseech, every one of you that, in the interests of trying to achieve actual resolutions on these matters, so that we may find ways to provide aid to millions of suffering sapients, everyone keep their statements germane to the specific topics being discussed, and not. He leaned forward a little and gave a hard look at the Elton ambassador. Try to retread over ground that has already been voted on and settled multiple times in council history, including, more than once, by those present. The lizard looked down his snout at him, with arms across his chest, but made a tiny gesture with a few fingers that he took for acquiesce. I will hold you to that, you little blighter. So, to the first item on the agenda today, regarding the matter of the scarcity of nutrient paste and the apparent wartime profiteering of said commodity by a great many Zoltan merchant captains. I object in the strongest terms to accusing my honest Zoltan captains. Once again, the Zoltan found himself almost instantly muted. Sometimes I wish we'd set the lockout on that mute for longer. We'll have to discuss a with prejudice option, or maybe a 3 strikes, and it gets longer or something. Caslor continued. As I was saying, profiteering by a great many Zoltan freighter captains, some of the human privateers. He gave a significant look over to the Zoltan, daring the man to fail to acknowledge his even-handedness. The lizard stood stock still and stared ahead, and various Pinigran merchants. The last announcement brought a number of exclamations of surprise. Most of them even seemed genuine. Rachlid Datara, the Pinigran ambassador, jerked his head up as if he'd been slapped. I hope no one else saw that he twitched just a moment too soon. Rachlid clapped his beak in frustration and stood on powerful hind legs. That is a bold accusation to make, Duke Caslor Feldara, and I object. Caslor raised a hand. I would not make such a statement. Lightly, Ambassador, and please note that I do not accuse the Crown. Though I should. Nor the Pinigran people as a whole of wrongdoing. Indeed, I will admit that your merchants are acting in a somewhat grey area in some ways. However, I have solid evidence to back my claims, and, grey area or not, the way they have been operating must be addressed by this council in an attempt to provide for the welfare of all neutral parties in these troubled times. Please, Ambassador Ratchild, no, don't interrupt again. I promise I will allow you the chance to say your piece. I have a great respect for you and your monarch, and ask that you allow me the respect of hearing what I have to say before trying to answer it. The large bird-like man drew himself up slightly, but gave a haughty bow of his head, so Caslor continued. Thank you. Now, I have made a number of bold statements. The proof to back my statements against both the Zoltan and the humans was delivered to all of you as quickly as my offices could compile and disseminate it. That said, for the record, I have asked the Venterhead ambassador to review certain proofs here today, and for several other ambassadors to read proofs from their own governments. On your screens, now you will see the schedule I propose for these reviews, as well as a proposal that the reviews be allowed to take place without interruption. After that, we can break for a late lunch, during which time the schedule for commentary and rebuttals will be proposed and voted upon. Please lock in your votes for this schedule now. Caslor had to put forth effort to show patience as ambassadors on various platforms conferred with their fellows. At least, when I am Prime Minister, this is one thing I won't have to worry about. The ability to set the agenda and avoid most of this voting on it is one of the most legitimate reasons to have a Prime Minister in the first place. Thankfully, the vote only took about 10 minutes, but Kaz still had to suppress a sigh. Inevitable, obvious, and near minus unanimous. And it still takes them 10 minutes. Why did I let my sister talk me into this? Thank you all. I will now turn the floor over to the Bytha ambassador, per the schedule, and he can speak to his data analyst's findings regarding the sale of nutrient paste. With that, Kasler sat down and turned his attention to the various ambassadors to gauge their reaction. He, his wives, and, when the man wasn't taking his turn to speak, Enable kept a running commentary on the crowd as the morning wore on. It contained a few surprises, mostly in terms of otherwise neutral and generally unassuming ambassadors standing to shout when certain points were made about the mistreatment of refugees. Still, even with that, things went essentially as he expected, and the ambassadors, for once, all kept their remarks mostly within their allotted time slots, and they finally got to break for lunch. A general din of conversation started up, and Golna poked him in the ribs with her elbow. "Only 2 hours over time, darling. You are already starting to train the little blighters. At this rate, you will have them all eating out of your hand before it is even time to take the vote." She laughed at him as he gave her a sharp look and rolled his eyes. Then she hooked her arm through his, and they walked out to their first rendezvous.